She's just the housekeeper.
Then why does losing her feel like losing everything?
It's Thursday morning, and the penthouse is quiet in a way it hasn't been in 3 years. No knock at the door. No sound of keys turning in the lock. Whitman stands alone by the kitchen counter, restless, pacing back and forth, unable to settle in a space that suddenly feels unfamiliar. For 3 years, this exact moment of the week belonged to someone else. A woman named Marisol Vance let herself into this apartment every single Thursday at 9 o'clock sharp, and Whitman Cole had built his entire week around a presence he never once thought to examine too closely. He didn't know her mother's name. He didn't know where she spent her holidays, or what she dreamed about when the workday ended. To him, she had simply always been there, the way the marble counters were there, the way the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline were there. Furniture with a heartbeat, easy to overlook, impossible to replace once it was gone. Now the counter sat untouched, dust gathering in the corners of a home that had never once looked unkept while Marisol worked there. Whitman told himself it didn't matter. He had a fiancée now, a polished, ambitious woman named Regina who filled every room she entered with perfume, opinions, and a certainty about the future that Whitman found himself quietly leaning on. But 3 weeks from this exact morning, sitting in a penthouse that had never felt so hollow, Whitman Cole would learn something that would break him in half. The woman who cleaned his home for 3 years had been carrying a secret that could have changed the entire trajectory of his life. And the woman he was about to marry was the reason he never found out in time to matter. This is the story of a man who mistook convenience for love, and a woman who chose silence over asking the world for what she was owed. Who was Marisol Vance before she disappeared from Whitman's life without a single word of goodbye? What did she know about the Cole family's history that no one else in that penthouse ever suspected? And why, after 3 years of quiet, unwavering loyalty, did she choose to vanish rather than speak up? These questions sound simple on the surface, but the answers reach back more than 2 decades into a decision made by a dying man who never found the courage to make it right while he still had the chance. This is a story about the people we walk past every single day without truly seeing them. The housekeeper, the driver, the assistant who remembers your coffee order but whose own name you've forgotten. It is a story about what happens when the quiet ones finally stop showing up and the world built around their invisible labor begins, slowly, to fall apart. Somewhere between a penthouse on the 40th floor and a modest apartment across the city, 2 women were about to collide over one man's inheritance, one man's grief, and a secret buried since before either of them was born. Whitman Cole believed he understood loyalty. He believed he understood love. By the end of this story, he would come to understand that he had confused both, for years, with something far less honest and far more convenient. Marisol Vance grew up in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, raised by her mother, Dorothy Vance. After her father passed away when Marisol was only 12 years old, Dorothy worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on and food on the table, and Marisol grew up believing, deep in her bones, that dignity had nothing to do with the size of a paycheck. She watched her mother return home exhausted night after night, never once complaining, and she absorbed that same quiet endurance without ever being taught it directly. It simply became who she was. She studied business administration for 2 years at a community college, working nights to cover tuition her mother couldn't afford. She had dreams then, ordinary and specific, the kind young women carry quietly without announcing them to the world. An office job, a promotion in a few years, maybe, eventually, a small business of her own. But when Dorothy's health began to decline, requiring costly treatment and constant care, Marisol made the decision without much hesitation. She left school, picked up steady work wherever she could find it, and let the dream fold itself away into a drawer she rarely opened again. Cleaning work paid consistently, and consistency was what her family needed most. She never let her exhaustion show. She never let her disappointment show either. When the cleaning agency assigned her to the Cole penthouse 3 years ago, Marisol expected exactly what she'd experienced with a dozen wealthy clients before him. Someone who wouldn't remember her name by the 2nd or 3rd visit. Someone whose home she would move through like a ghost. Whitman Cole turned out to be different, though not in the way most people might assume. He wasn't especially kind, not at first. He was distracted, hollowed out, and carrying a grief he never once spoke about out loud. His father, Nathaniel Cole, had passed away roughly 18 months before Marisol began working there, leaving Whitman a real estate empire he never asked for and a penthouse that, if you knew where to look, still faintly carried the scent of his father's cologne. Marisol noticed things other people missed. She noticed that Whitman flinched every time a storm rolled in over the city, a reaction that traced back to a childhood memory he had never once discussed with anyone, including his own fiancée. She noticed the framed photograph of his father tucked face down in a drawer, a man unable to look at his father's image but equally unable to throw it away. She noticed the unmarked medication bottle in the bathroom cabinet, prescribed for anxiety Whitman insisted to everyone, including himself, that he did not have. She never brought any of it up directly. That wasn't her place, and she knew it. Instead, she left small signs that she saw him, quiet gestures that asked for nothing in return. A blanket folded neatly over his favorite reading chair on cold evenings. A specific brand of tea, the same one his father used to drink, left steaming on the counter every year on the anniversary of Nathaniel's death, with no note, no explanation, nothing that could be traced back to intention. Whitman began to notice the noticing, even if he couldn't name what he was feeling. He couldn't explain, not even to himself, why the apartment felt different in the hours after she left each week, why the silence afterward sat heavier on his chest than the silence before she arrived. He told himself it was simply thorough cleaning. He told his friends the same thing when they teased him about how oddly attached he seemed to his housekeeper's weekly schedule, how his mood seemed to shift depending on whether it was a Thursday or not. He never once considered that what he felt might be something closer to being cared for, an experience he had not truly had since his father's death, and if he was honest with himself, for a long stretch of years before that as well. Nathaniel Cole had been a demanding father, more comfortable expressing love through provision than through presence, and Whitman had spent his entire adult life mistaking financial security for emotional safety. Meanwhile, Regina Cole, though not yet legally married to him, had already claimed the title in every practical sense that mattered to her. She was polished in a way that photographed beautifully beside him at company galas and industry events. She understood which fork to use at a 5-course dinner, which designers to be seen wearing, which charitable causes carried the right kind of visibility for a family like the Coles. What she had never once done, not in the 2 years they had been together, was ask Whitman how he was really doing, beneath the surface, on an ordinary Tuesday, when nothing in particular had gone wrong. Her questions were always practical. Schedules, appearances, the precise timeline for their engagement announcement, and the wedding that would follow it. Whitman told himself this was simply how successful, driven people loved each other, efficiently, without excess emotional mess getting in the way of progress. He had nothing else to measure it against. No one had ever shown him what quiet, unasked for care actually looked like in practice, until a housekeeper started leaving him tea he had never once requested, on a date she had no obvious reason to remember. There were other small moments too, easy to overlook individually, but heavy when considered together. Marisol learned, without ever being told directly, which room Whitman avoided during thunderstorms, and made sure that room was always the last one she cleaned, giving him space without ever naming why. She noticed when his sleep schedule grew erratic during difficult business quarters, and left the apartment slightly quieter on those days, small adjustments a person only makes when they are paying real attention. Regina, by contrast, filled the apartment with noise regardless of what kind of week Whitman was having, her presence a constant regardless of his internal state. The trouble began the week Regina decided to move some of her belongings into the penthouse ahead of the wedding. Eager to establish ownership over every detail of the space she would soon call her own. For the first time since the engagement began, she turned her full attention toward the quiet woman who let herself into the apartment every Thursday morning using her own key. This arrangement had never sat comfortably with Regina, even before she understood why, and now, with the wedding approaching, she decided it was finally time to look closer. What Regina found during her first real inspection of the penthouse unsettled her far more than an unfamiliar housekeeper ever could on its own. In a drawer tucked inside Whitman's study, hidden behind old tax documents no one had touched in years, she discovered a folded letter written in his father's unmistakable handwriting. Interrupted by a phone call before she could finish reading it in full, she managed to catch enough to understand that it mentioned a debt owed to a family named Vance, and a promise Nathaniel Cole had made to himself before his death, a promise he had apparently never kept. Regina said nothing to Whitman about what she had found. Instead, she folded the letter carefully back into its original position and began quietly gathering information, starting with the housekeeper's full legal name. Information she extracted from the cleaning agency's paperwork under the guise of routine household administration. It did not take Regina long to confirm exactly what she feared. The housekeeper's surname matched the name written in that letter precisely. Vance. She still did not understand the full scope of what the letter implied, but she understood more than enough to recognize a serious threat to the future she had spent years carefully constructing. If there was money owed, a debt Whitman knew absolutely nothing about, and if the person that debt was owed to had been quietly present inside their home every single week for 3 years, Regina decided this situation needed to disappear, and it needed to disappear quickly, quietly, and without ever tracing back to her. She did not confront Marisol directly, understanding instinctively that a direct confrontation might invite exactly the kind of scrutiny she was trying to avoid. She did not ask Whitman a single question about what he might already know. Instead, Regina went straight to the property management company overseeing the housekeeping contract and filed a formal complaint, citing vague, carefully worded concerns about professionalism and appropriate boundaries between household staff and residents. Without ever stating it outright, she implied that the closeness between the housekeeper and her fiancé had crossed a line that made her deeply uncomfortable in her role as the future lady of the house. The agency, eager above all else to keep a wealthy, high-profile client satisfied, terminated Marisol's assignment within 4 days, effective immediately, with no real explanation offered beyond a generic letter referencing unspecified staffing changes. Marisol received the news over the phone on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. She did not argue. She did not ask a single question. She had spent her entire life learning, gradually and painfully, that people without institutional power rarely receive explanations, only outcomes they are expected to accept quietly. Standing in her small kitchen holding the phone, she thought briefly, involuntarily, about the letter she had found in that study drawer nearly 2 years earlier, the one mentioning her mother's name and a debt owed by a man named Nathaniel Cole. She had never told Whitman what she'd seen that day, cleaning a drawer she probably shouldn't have opened so thoroughly. She had never once asked for anything based on what she now knew. She simply folded the memory away carefully, the same unhurried way she folded his blankets each week, quietly and without complaint, without leverage, without anything that might have been mistaken for a demand. On what she believed would be her final Thursday inside that penthouse, Marisol packed her small bag of cleaning supplies slowly, methodically, the way she always did, even though she now understood there would be no next Thursday to prepare for. She left one final gesture behind, not out of hope that it would change anything, but out of pure habit, a habit built over 3 years of showing up fully even when no one asked her to. On a small sticky note left on the kitchen counter, she wrote 4 words in her neat, careful handwriting. "Thank you for seeing me." She placed the apartment key beside the note and walked out of the penthouse for what she genuinely believed, in that moment, would be the very last time in her life. The walk to the elevator that morning felt longer than it ever had before. She passed the same hallway art she had dusted every week for 3 years without ever really looking at it closely, and now, leaving for good, she noticed it fully for the first time. A small irony she carried with her down 40 floors and out into a city that had no idea anything had changed at all. Whitman noticed her absence before he ever fully understood the reason behind it. He came home from a long, draining week of back-to-back meetings to find the apartment exactly as he had left it that morning, dust quietly settling into corners that had always been immaculate by Thursday evening without him ever once wondering how that happened. Something about the stillness bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately put into words, a low, persistent unease he tried to dismiss as simple tiredness. Regina, when he casually mentioned it, explained that the cleaning agency had made some internal staffing changes and that a new person would be assigned to the unit soon. Whitman accepted this explanation for nearly 2 full weeks, distracted by mounting work pressure and by a wedding planning process that seemed to swallow every conversation he had with his fiancée whole, leaving little room for anything else. It was the sticky note that finally undid the explanation Regina had offered. He found it half tucked beneath a fruit bowl, nearly discarded by a temporary cleaner who had absolutely no idea what those 4 small words meant to the man who would eventually find them. "Thank you for seeing me," written in unfamiliar handwriting he somehow still recognized instantly. Whitman stood in his own kitchen holding a piece of paper barely the size of his palm, and for reasons he could not immediately explain even to himself, his hands began to shake. He realized, standing there, that he did not even know the housekeeper's last name. 3 years, and he had never once asked. The realization landed with a weight that surprised him, heavier than it had any logical right to be. He called the cleaning agency directly that same evening, requesting detailed information about the woman who had serviced his unit faithfully for the past 3 years. The representative on the line, clearly uncomfortable, explained that a formal complaint had been filed by someone residing in the unit, and that the housekeeper's contract had been terminated as a direct result of that complaint. Whitman asked, more firmly this time, whose name was attached to the complaint. The representative, bound by company policy, declined to say directly, but the long pause before her careful non-answer told Whitman almost everything he needed to know before she even finished the sentence. Whitman confronted Regina about it that same night, his voice steadier than he expected it to be. She dismissed his concern almost immediately, framing it as an overreaction to the ordinary churn of domestic staff in buildings like theirs. People came and went constantly. She reminded him, it meant nothing. She suggested, gently but with unmistakable firmness, that his attachment to a housekeeper's weekly schedule was unusual for a man just weeks away from his own wedding, and perhaps worth some honest self-reflection. Whitman, uncertain of his own feelings and unwilling to spark open conflict so close to the ceremony, let the conversation end there that night, though the unease sitting in his chest refused to follow his instructions to disappear along with it. Over the following days, he began quietly asking around, carefully, without drawing attention to what he was really doing. A doorman who had worked the building lobby for years remembered Marisol warmly, describing her without hesitation as the kind of person who always remembered residents' names, who never once complained about long hours or difficult tenants, who greeted him personally every single Thursday morning regardless of her own exhaustion. Eventually, through a mutual acquaintance at the cleaning agency, Whitman managed to track down contact information for Priya Anand, Marisol's closest friend and former co-worker. Priya agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to meet him for coffee, and she did not bother hiding her frustration once they sat down together. She told Whitman plainly that Marisol had been let go without warning, based entirely on a complaint she was never once allowed to see or respond to, and that Marisol had said absolutely nothing in her own defense, because she had never truly believed defending herself would change the outcome anyway. Priya also mentioned something in passing that stopped Whitman completely cold, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. She said that Marisol had once told her, casually, almost as an afterthought, about a letter she had discovered years earlier tucked inside his father's old study, a letter that mentioned her own family's name in connection to the Cole family's history. Marisol had never once raised the subject with Whitman directly. She told Priya she didn't want him thinking she was after something, some kind of payout or advantage. She simply wanted to keep showing up, keep doing her job well, and let the past remain exactly where it was, because that felt safer, easier, than risking the one steady, dependable thing she still had left in her life. That single detail sent Whitman straight back into his father's old study for the first time in over a year, his heart pounding in a way he couldn't entirely explain. He searched the exact same drawer Regina had quietly searched months earlier without his knowledge, and there it was, folded precisely where it had always been, waiting. A letter in his father's unmistakable handwriting, dated nearly 23 years earlier, addressed to no one in particular, written, it seemed, simply so Nathaniel Cole could get the truth out of his own chest, never actually intending for anyone to read it at all. Whitman sat down at his father's old desk and read it twice through before he could fully process what it said. The letter revealed a story Whitman had never once heard, not from his father, not from anyone. Decades earlier, long before the Cole real estate empire took its current shape, Nathaniel Cole had partnered with a man named Robert Vance, Marisol's grandfather, to secure the original land deal that would eventually become the foundation of the entire family fortune. Robert Vance had put up capital he genuinely could not afford to lose, trusting a simple handshake agreement rather than a formal written contract, a common practice among men of his generation who considered their word as binding as any signature. When the deal succeeded far beyond anyone's original expectations, Nathaniel Cole quietly restructured the ownership terms in a way that left Robert Vance with almost nothing to show for the risk he had taken, a calculated betrayal carefully disguised as standard business practice, the kind of maneuver that would have looked entirely legal to anyone who didn't know the full history behind it. Nathaniel had lived out the remainder of his life carrying that decision like a stone in his chest, according to his own words. The letter described a guilt he never managed to resolve, and a debt he always intended to repay properly, but never found the courage to address directly, year after year, decade after decade, until it was simply too late. He wrote, in his own careful hand, that he owed the Vance family far more than money alone. He owed them the truth, and he was deeply ashamed that pride, and fear of what admitting the truth might cost him, had kept him from delivering either while Robert Vance was still alive to hear it. Whitman brought the letter directly to Harold Bregman, his father's longtime attorney, a man who had known Nathaniel for over 30 years. Harold confirmed every detail with quiet, visibly uncomfortable honesty, the kind of honesty that comes from carrying a secret far too long. Harold explained that Nathaniel had asked him, years before his death, to look into locating any surviving members of the Vance family, fully intending to make things right before he passed away. But the diagnosis that eventually took his life had arrived far too suddenly, and the task was left permanently unfinished, buried along with everything else Nathaniel Cole never got around to saying out loud while he still had the chance. The full realization hit Whitman like a physical blow to the chest. The woman who had cleaned his home every single Thursday for 3 years, who left him tea on the anniversary of his father's death, without ever once explaining why, who folded his blankets and remembered small, specific details about his life that even his own fiancée had never bothered to notice, was the granddaughter of the exact man his own father had wronged decades earlier. She had known. She had found that letter herself, years before Whitman ever did, and she had said absolutely nothing. She had asked for absolutely nothing. She had simply kept showing up and doing her job with more quiet integrity than anyone else in his entire life had ever shown him, including the people he was related to by blood. Whitman confronted Regina with everything he now understood, laying it all out plainly, watching her face for any sign of surprise that never came. This time she did not deflect, could not deflect, cornered completely by the weight of what he already knew. She admitted, coldly at first, and then with mounting defensiveness, that she had found the letter months earlier, understood exactly what it implied about the family's fortune, and made the deliberate decision to have Marisol removed before the housekeeper could ever connect the pieces herself and potentially make a claim against everything Regina had spent years positioning herself to inherit. She insisted, repeatedly, that she had done it all to protect their future together, framing her calculated betrayal as a kind of loyalty, an act of love twisted into something Whitman no longer recognized as either. Whitman listened to the full explanation and felt something inside him go quiet and cold in a way he had never experienced before. He realized, standing in the exact kitchen where a small sticky note had once sat tucked beneath a fruit bowl, that the woman he was about to legally bind his entire life to had been willing to erase another human being completely, without hesitation, in order to protect an inheritance neither of them had actually earned through their own effort. He thought about all the small things Regina had never noticed about him in 2 years together. The thunderstorms, the medication, the photograph turned face down in a drawer, and he thought about a housekeeper who had noticed all of it within months, and said nothing, asked for nothing, simply left tea on a counter and let him figure out the rest in his own time. Whitman ended the engagement that same week, calmly and without theatrics, though the conversation itself was anything but calm on Regina's end. Regina, furious and blindsided, accused him of choosing a housekeeper over the carefully built life they had constructed together. Whitman understood, by then, with a clarity that surprised him, that there had never really been a life built between them at all, only an arrangement dressed up carefully to resemble one. He returned his mother's ring to its velvet box and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something closer to relief than obligation settle over him. Finding Marisol again was not simple. She had left her old apartment after losing her job, unable to keep up with rent on her own, and moved back in with her mother, Dorothy, in the same small East Side apartment where Marisol herself had grown up decades earlier. Whitman eventually located the address through Priya, who agreed to help only after making him promise, in no uncertain terms, that he wasn't showing up to offer money as a substitute for a real apology, because Marisol did not need to be bought. She needed, finally, to be truly seen, and money alone would only confirm every quiet suspicion she'd carried for years that people like him would never offer anything more than a transaction. When Whitman finally stood at Dorothy's front door, Marisol did not immediately invite him inside. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed protectively, and told him plainly, without any bitterness in her voice, that she had not disappeared in order to be found. She had disappeared because she was simply tired, bone tired, of being useful to people who never once thought to ask how she was actually doing underneath the surface. Whitman did not arrive with an inheritance settlement or a lawyer's carefully worded letter. He offered an apology instead, plain, unpolished, and honest, admitting openly that he had lived beside her for 3 full years without ever learning her last name, and that he felt genuine shame realizing how long it had taken him to notice a debt far older and far heavier than money could ever fully repay. He told her everything. About the letter, about his father's decades of unresolved guilt, about Regina's calculated betrayal, about ending the engagement entirely, without regret. He told her he hadn't come to fix a legal wrong with a check written in haste. He came because he finally understood, fully and for the first time, what it truly meant to be cared for by someone who wanted absolutely nothing in return, and he was not willing to lose that understanding twice in one lifetime, not after finally learning what it felt like. Marisol listened without interrupting once, carrying the same quiet, unhurried patience she had carried through 3 full years of Thursdays spent inside his home. She did not fall into his arms. She did not offer forgiveness on the spot, and she made that clear without apology. She told him she needed time, real time, to decide what she genuinely wanted, separate entirely from guilt, separate from any inheritance, separate from anything technically owed to her family by his. Whitman respected that boundary completely, for what felt like the first time in his adult life, finally understanding that real care meant patiently waiting for someone rather than expecting immediate gratitude simply for finally noticing them. In the weeks that followed, he formalized a proper financial settlement directly with Dorothy Vance, not framed as an apology disguised as a payout, but honored as a debt his own father had always intended to repay, finally closed out with honesty instead of decades more silence. Dorothy signed the paperwork at her own small kitchen table, the same table Marisol had studied at as a young woman with dreams of a business degree she never finished. Whitman noticed the table. He noticed the worn edges, the careful patchwork repairs. He said nothing about it, but he noticed, and for Marisol, watching quietly from the doorway, that alone said more than any apology ever could. Whitman Cole spent 3 full years being quietly cared for by a woman he never truly took the time to see, and it took losing her completely to finally understand that the smallest, quietest acts of loyalty are often the realest ones any of us are ever offered in this life. Marisol Vance never once asked for recognition. She never used her family's painful history as leverage against a man who could have made her disappear with a single phone call. She simply kept showing up, kept being decent in a world that rarely rewards decency, and let her actions speak clearly in a house full of people who had never truly learned how to listen. We want to know what you think. Would you have noticed the signs Whitman missed for 3 long years, or would you have walked past her the same way he did, week after week, without ever once asking her name? Tell us in the comments below exactly what you would have done in Marisol's position: silence or confrontation, patience or demand. And if this story moved you the way we think it will, wait until you hear what happens in our next one. Subscribe for more real stories about the people we overlook every single day, and the quiet truths that always, eventually, find their way to the surface.